There is a form of military defeat that does not look like defeat from the outside. There are no dramatic surrenders, no flags lowered, no press conferences announcing the loss of territory. There is only a slow, accumulating series of decisions, operational decisions, logistical decisions, command decisions, that individually appear reasonable and collectively constitute an admission that a strategic objective is no longer achievable. Military historians have a term for it. They call it culmination. The point at which an offensive or defensive operation has exhausted its capacity to achieve its intended purpose. Culmination is not defeat in the battlefield sense, but it is the moment from which defeat becomes inevitable if the underlying conditions do not change. The Northern Front reached culmination approximately 6 weeks ago, and the military leaders on both sides of this conflict, and in the capitals that supply and support those military leaders, know it. What they are not doing is saying it publicly. What they are doing is managing the narrative, issuing statements about operational adjustments, about strategic consolidation, about planned repositioning, that use the language of active military management to describe what is, in operational reality, a condition of strategic paralysis. I want to be careful here, because language matters in ways that can mislead as much as illuminate. I am not saying the Northern Front has collapsed in the sense of catastrophic military failure. I am saying that the operational data, the logistics throughput numbers, the casualty replacement rates, the ammunition consumption figures relative to supply, the rate of territorial change, all point in the same direction, and that direction is inconsistent with achieving the strategic objectives that were publicly stated at the beginning of this operation. The gap between stated objectives and operational capacity is the definition of strategic failure. And that gap on the Northern Front is now significant and documented. In the next 20 minutes, I'm going to walk you through exactly what that data shows, why it is being suppressed from public discourse, and what the strategic consequences are for the broader conflict, for the regional powers that have invested in its outcome, and for the civilian populations that are paying the most catastrophic price of all for decisions made in offices far from the front. Subscribe now, because what you are about to hear is not the version of this conflict that official communications want you to have. It is the version that the operational data actually supports. To understand the Northern Front, you need to understand why it was considered strategically decisive in the first place. The Northern Front controls the primary land corridor connecting the operational depth of one side's logistical network to the forward positions that determine the tactical balance in the central theater. Military doctrine, specifically the principles of operational art that govern how strategic objectives are translated into battlefield campaigns, identifies this type of corridor control as a center of gravity. A center of gravity is not simply an important position. It is the critical capability or condition from which all other capabilities derive their effectiveness. Control of the Northern Corridor does not just affect the Northern Front. It determines the supply situation for the entire forward operational area. And when a center of gravity cannot be adequately defended, the operational system it supports begins to degrade. The Northern Corridor has been under sustained pressure for 9 weeks. The degradation of logistical throughput through that corridor, according to supply chain analysis published by Jane's Defense Weekly and cross-referenced with commercial satellite imagery reviewed by the Institute for the Study of War, has reduced effective supply capacity to approximately 40% of the planning baseline. 40% of baseline is not a supply challenge that can be managed through operational adjustments. It is a supply crisis that forces the selection of which units to supply and which units to leave under-resourced. And that triage of resources, on which the command has been conducting for at least 4 weeks based on the observable changes in operational tempo, is itself evidence of culmination. Announcement number 1, the casualty replacement rate on the Northern Front has broken the threshold below which a sustained defensive posture becomes operationally untenable. And this is the data point that military leaders are working hardest to conceal. Modern military doctrine holds that a force can sustain roughly 30% casualties before its operational effectiveness degrades to the point where reorganization, rather than continued combat operations, becomes the command priority. Above 30% casualties, units begin to lose cohesion, the communication, trust, and practice coordination between soldiers and between formations that determines battlefield effectiveness. Individual soldiers can still fight. Units begin to fight as collections of individuals rather than as integrated teams, and the difference in combat effectiveness is significant. According to analysis published by the Royal United Services Institute in London and confirmed by 3 military analysts who have reviewed casualty documentation from regional health systems, the effective casualty rate in the Northern Front's primary defensive formations has exceeded 35% in the past 6 weeks. This data does not come from official military communications. Official military communications on both sides report casualty figures that diverge significantly from what the medical system data, the personnel replacement request records, and the unit size observations from commercial satellite imagery collectively indicate. The divergence between official casualty reporting and medical/logistical data is not unusual in conflict. All parties to all modern conflicts manage casualty reporting for domestic political reasons. What is unusual about the Northern Front is the scale of the divergence. According to the RUSI analysis, official figures represent approximately 40 to 50% of actual casualties, and the systemic nature of the underreporting, which involves not just raw casualty numbers but the classification of casualties in ways that understate the operational impact. I want to be transparent about what I can and cannot know with certainty here. Medical system data and satellite imagery provide inference, not direct observation. The researchers making these assessments are experienced and rigorous, but they are working with indirect evidence. What I am presenting is the weight of expert analysis from credible, nonpartisan defense research institutions, not classified intelligence product. With that caveat stated, the pattern is consistent and the direction is clear. Received. That is announcement number 1. Stay with me, because announcement number 2 is the element of this story that has the most direct consequences for the conflict's eventual outcome, and it concerns a decision that was made at the command level approximately 3 weeks ago that has not been publicly acknowledged. Announcement number 2: the operational command on the Northern Front has quietly suspended its counteroffensive planning cycle. This decision, which represents an acknowledgement that the capacity for offensive action no longer exists in the near term, was made at the operational command level and has not been communicated to political leadership in language that accurately characterizes its significance. Let me explain what a planning cycle suspension means in military terms, because this is not the kind of detail that receives attention in political journalism. Military commands at the operational level maintain continuous planning cycles, processes by which staff officers develop, refine, and maintain plans for multiple contingencies, including offensive operations, at various readiness levels. A planning cycle is not the same as an operational order. It is the organizational activity that keeps options viable. When a planning cycle is suspended, when staff resources are reallocated from offensive option development to defensive posture management, it signals that the command has made an operational judgment that offensive capacity is not available in the planning horizon. This decision is typically reversible in theory, but difficult to reverse in practice because the expertise, the staff focus, and the logistical preparation associated with offensive planning cannot be recreated quickly. According to 2 European Defense Ministry officials speaking to Le Monde on background, and confirmed by a senior NATO analyst cited by Der Spiegel, the planning cycle suspension on the Northern Front has been acknowledged in private briefings to Allied governments but not characterized in those briefings in terms that indicate its full operational significance. Allied governments were told that the command was consolidating its planning focus and prioritizing defensive depth. These are accurate descriptions. They are also descriptions that obscure the operational reality that offensive capacity on the Northern Front, for the foreseeable planning horizon, is exhausted. Why does this matter beyond the Northern Front itself? Because the Northern Front's strategic function was not primarily defensive. It was designed to generate pressure that forced the opposing side to divert resources from the central theater, reducing pressure on the positions that matter most for the conflict's overall outcome. A Northern Front that is not generating offensive pressure, that is instead consuming resources in static defense, is not achieving its strategic function. It is a strategic liability with a defensive justification. Announcement number 3. The international support architecture that has sustained the Northern Front's logistics is fracturing along fault lines that have been developing for 18 months, and the fracturing is now visible in procurement data. Sustained military operations require sustained international supply. The Northern Front's logistical baseline depends on a supply architecture involving 4 primary external contributors. According to defense procurement analysis published by Oryx, the open-source defense analysis platform, and cross-referenced with port manifest data from the primary logistics hub serving this theater, the volume of military supply flowing to the Northern Front from 2 of those 4 primary contributors has declined by approximately 35% over the past 12 weeks, compared to the preceding 12-week period. This is not a delivery delay. It is a policy signal communicated through supply reduction rather than through diplomatic statements. Supply reduction is the preferred method for external powers to communicate strategic dissatisfaction without triggering the public diplomatic consequences of explicit policy statements. When a country reduces supply by 35% over 12 weeks without a public explanation, it is telling the recipient government something that it is not willing to say openly. What it is saying, based on the context of the private diplomatic communications that have been reported by three separate European news organizations, is that the strategic calculus on the Northern Front has changed, and continued investment in a theater that has reached culmination does not serve the external contributors' interests. Here is what the mainstream coverage is missing, and it needs to be said clearly. The coverage of the Northern Front in Western media has been dominated by tactical reporting, specific engagements, specific positions, specific unit actions, that is both accurate and systematically misleading. It is accurate because the individual tactical events are real. It is systematically misleading because tactical accuracy divorced from operational context creates a narrative in which things are always happening on the Northern Front: action, engagement, response, that disguises the operational reality that the cumulative direction of all this action is unfavorable, and increasingly so. Military historians call this the difference between tactical activity and operational progress. You can have enormous tactical activity, continuous engagement, continuous reporting, continuous dramatic events, while making zero operational progress toward your strategic objectives. The Northern Front has had enormous tactical activity for 9 weeks. It has made zero operational progress toward the strategic objectives that justified its opening. And the gap between tactical activity and operational progress is precisely the gap that official communications are filling with language designed to make the former sound like the latter. The sardonic footnote here is that the language of strategic consolidation has become so normalized in military communication that it requires effort to remember that consolidation is not advance, that repositioning is not initiative, and that managing a deteriorating situation with skill is not the same as controlling it. For the civilian populations in the areas affected by the Northern Front's operational status, the distinction between tactical activity and operational progress is not an academic one. Sustained military operations in contested areas produce civilian casualties, displacement, infrastructure destruction, and humanitarian conditions that worsen with duration. A conflict that has reached culmination on a given front, but that continues kinetic operations, because neither side has found a political framework for de-escalation, is a conflict that continues producing human cost without producing strategic outcome. The human cost is real. The strategic outcome is no longer being generated. The historical parallel that illuminates this situation most precisely is not a military victory or defeat. It is the Western Front of the First World War, specifically the period from late 1915 through 1916, when both sides had essentially reached culmination, but neither had the political framework or the domestic political will to acknowledge it. The response was not de-escalation. It was escalation. The Somme-Verdun attempts to break through a stalemate by concentrating enormous force at single points. Both battles produced catastrophic casualties. Neither produced the breakthrough that military commanders promised political leaders. The operational logic of culmination is unforgiving. If the underlying conditions that produced culmination are not changed, additional force does not produce different results. It produces more casualties at the same rate of operational non-progress. The conditions that produced culmination on the Northern Front, the degraded logistics, the casualty replacement shortfall, the supply architecture fractures, are not being changed by continued kinetic operations. They require either a fundamental restructuring of the support architecture, which would require political decisions that have not been made, or a negotiated adjustment of the operational situation, which requires a political process that does not currently exist. Let me give you 3 paths forward. Path 1, supply architecture rescue. One or more external contributors makes a decisive commitment to restore and expand the supply architecture at a pace that reverses the logistical degradation. This would require overcoming the political obstacles that produce the current supply reduction, and it would require a commitment of resources that exceeds what any current external contributor has signaled willingness to provide. I put this at approximately 20% probability in the next 90 days, higher over a longer horizon if the conflict's overall strategic situation deteriorates to a point where external contributors recalculate. Path 2, manage strategic withdrawal and reorientation. The Northern Front's operational posture is formally restructured, publicly characterized as planned redeployment, in a way that releases resources for the central theater while maintaining a credible defensive presence. This is the strategically rational path given the operational data. It requires political leadership to accept the domestic communication challenge of explaining a withdrawal as a strategic choice rather than an operational failure. This is politically difficult, but not impossible, and it is probably the path that operational commanders are currently arguing for in private. I put this at 40% probability. Path 3, continued operational attrition without strategic resolution. The current situation persists, tactically active, operationally stagnant, strategically inconclusive. for another 3 to 6 months until either an external shock forces a reassessment or the cumulative costs produce a political crisis that forces decision making. This is the inertia path. It is the path that produces the worst human cost for the least strategic benefit. And it is, unfortunately, the path that bureaucratic and political inertia tend to produce when no actor has sufficient authority and courage to choose one of the rational alternatives. I put this at 40% probability. Watch the supply manifest data. Watch the official language used to describe Northern Front operations, specifically whether the language of offensive objective begins to disappear from public communications and is replaced exclusively by the language of defensive consolidation. That linguistic shift, when it becomes consistent, will tell you that the private acknowledgement of culmination has become the public narrative, and that the question has shifted from whether to how. Tell me in the comments whether you think political leadership on either side will choose Path 2 before Path 3 produces a crisis. Tell me what indicator you are watching to track the Northern Front's operational status. We will be tracking every development and every data point in this theater. Subscribe now. Share this analysis. The silence around the Northern Front's operational reality is not accidental. Breaking that silence is exactly what this analysis is here to do.